Um, where to begin? Uh, when Norma Jean was a child, very, very young, she she's in a movie theater with one of her first parental figures. Norma Jean had the most fascinating early life ever that truly informs her persona, her legend, her symbol. Um, she was born to a mother who was schizophrenic, whose own mother was schizophrenic. Her entire lineage is mentally ill, and Marilyn Monroe certainly battled uh, the voices in her head for as long as she lived, which wasn't incredibly long. And Ida Bolender was a kind of, by some accounts, she was fanatical, a religious type, and by other accounts, she was reasonable but strict. All I know is that when she was very young, she had stayed with Ida Bolender, um, and this was after her great grandmother had broke into the Bollender's house to try to suffocate young baby Norma Jean with a pillow um, before her mind completely disintegrated and she had to be institutionalized and died shortly thereafter. That was Norma's grandmother. Her mother wasn't too much better. In fact, her mother's health would deteriorate completely. Her psyche would vanish and become dangerous and troubling. But the story I'm trying to get to, the anecdote, so where I could frame this video, is that when Norma Jean was very young, going to the movie theater was out of the question. Ida Bolender, her guardian, would say, "No, no, I don't know what you'll be exposed to. Think about this, Norma. If the end of the world came and you were in a movie theater, you would burn in hell with the rest of them." Now, when Marilyn was grown up, she thought that was a terrible thing to do to a child, to scare her like that. But her first exposure to the movies was fire and brimstone. Her mother was a film cutter. Consolidary, I forgot exactly the film company. It might have been an offshoot of Columbia, Poverty Row, or at least Grace was. Grace was another woman who would come to parent Marilyn in a large way. In fact, she did become her legal guardian. Grace, a friend of her mother's. When her mother became too unwell and had to be institutionalized, Grace took complete control of the child. And Grace worked for film production companies, and she was a bit too involved, too invested in dreams of stardom, in Hollywood dreams. And from a very young age, she talked to Marilyn Monroe about Jean Harlow. Grace Goddard would be her name. She was obsessed with Jean Harlow, and she tried to mold a very young Marilyn Monroe into Jean Harlow, which meant to kind of sexualize her appearance as an 8-year-old, for instance, or as an 11-year-old, to sexualize her appearance, to make it artificial in a way, to remind her to create a persona. So a persona that was likable, a persona that also had currency to it, that could be cashed in within Hollywood. And Grace was a bit confusing as well, or a bit confused, because she sent young Norma Jean to an orphanage so that she could enjoy a marriage, and her then husband did not want to take care of yet another child, that being Norma Jean, so Grace placed her in an orphanage in California, and she remembers that as the darkest times of her life. Now, accounts vary as to how terrible it was, but I think that's almost putting this within a contest of misery, and I wish that biographers and film academics would stop fucking doing that shit, would stop being like, well, Marilyn didn't have that much to cry about. Motherfucker, she grew up in a world that rejected her at every turn. Every single parental figure rejected her until she ended up in an orphanage. unwanted. And it was in that orphanage that she wanted to be something so beautiful you couldn't look away, or you had to rear your head back and gaze. Something so beautiful you couldn't ignore. Something so sexy, so erotic, so beautiful that you could not reject them. Something so special that you couldn't reject them. Marilyn Monroe, if I could frame this whole thing as Marilyn Monroe being an orphan, adopted by the cinema, forever, by you and I. She is cinema's native daughter. Possibly the only one that cinema has ever fostered and taken care of. And of course we can see how well film takes care of their own, which is not very. So we had this image of Marilyn, of the real Marilyn, or even the fake one. It's hard to tell sometimes. She was a lot more self-aware and much smarter than anyone gives her credit for. We had this idea of a vulnerable, beautiful babe, in a way, which comes across in a lot of her dramatic roles, sure, but not in musicals, because musicals, they adhere to a different standard. In musicals, women are generally, you don't step over them, you don't trample over them. Women are generally much more confident and they symbolize momentum in so many different ways. And in Howard Hawks' film, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, it is no different. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, I think, is a lot of fun. And she's paired up here with Jane Russell, and Jane Russell, not many people can stand toe-to-toe with Marilyn's beauty in a kind of contest of eroticism and charm and equal her. Jane Russell is incredible here. And of course, Hawks and Russell enjoyed a good working relationship. And Hawks knew how to frame Russell. And more importantly, Jane Russell understood Marilyn Monroe on this film. She was able to help her through her insecurities. She was a deeply insecure actress. And to make her feel at home. They got along famously. And while the film isn't a beautiful film, it's a lot of fun and does have one of the greatest scenes of the 50s within the film. Actually, one of the top 3 greatest scenes in musical cinema in this film, which is "Diamonds are a girl's best friend. Da 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 da. Diamonds are a girl's best friend." The Marilyn Monroe number, that lush orange and pink, and with all of these men like miming shooting themselves, pantomiming defeat, or just showering this woman with all of this jewelry. And it's on the eve of the sexual revolution of the late 50s and mid 60s. It's on the eve of that, right? And Marilyn Monroe is so beautiful, so gorgeous, and so funny. And the choreography that Hawks was able to implement and capture within Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend is startlingly unforgettable. Marilyn wanted to be something you could never reject, something you could never forget. Well, she achieved that in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. You will never forget the Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend song, the number. You will never forget it. Once you've seen it, it will always be there in your mind. I'd also like to talk about River of No Return today. Now, these films are directed by 2 pretty interesting filmmakers. You got Howard Hawks on Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which is a very funny, very sexy, very cool movie. It also stars Charles Coburn from like The Devil and Miss Jones and The More the Merrier. He's a really cool character actor, and it's great seeing him here. But of course, Marilyn and Jane steal the show. And that was made by Howard Hawks, who is a very interesting and capable filmmaker. Another very interesting filmmaker, who I don't think I've ever actually discussed before, because he's rather difficult to parse, is Otto Preminger, who wrote, he didn't write it, he directed River of No Return. Now, at first, on the making of this film, Otto and Marilyn were getting along quite well. But this was when I think Marilyn's first acting coach was always on set. She always had an acting coach on set. And the one she had on set for River of No Return always usurped the director and kind of convinced Marilyn to deliver her lines in ways that were nearly robotic in a hypersexualized yet artificial feeling way, which I think Otto hated. And most of the crew actually hated as well. And at first, Marilyn and Otto got along great, and by the end, as the story tends to go with people who directed Marilyn Monroe, he couldn't stand her anymore. River of No Return co-stars Robert Mitchum, and Robert Mitchum is excellent. He is great. Preminger is interesting because his films are always on the verge of something deeply problematically fascinating. Like in Laura, the second it goes to a private detective having sexual fantasies of a dying woman's portrait, we discard that and show the woman's still alive. Or like an Anatomy of a Murder, when we start to flirt with like tales of morality, of the dark moralism behind the justice system in a large way. We discard that. And Bonjour Tristesse, I mean, when he was with Gene Seberg, who he was married to for quite a while, he was in Bonjour Tristesse and kind of in Saint Joan, he had more of an ability to explore these darker artifacts of cinema, and he did that wonderfully in Bonjour Tristesse with Gene Seberg. She was truly a great muse for the director. In River of No Return, there's a scene where Robert Mitchum is kind of forcing himself onto Marilyn Monroe in the woods, and that's where we get problematically interesting, yet the director discards it as well. Or he sanitizes it in a very large way. But we could have gotten pretty confrontational there. Don't normally see Marilyn being cornered, being grappled with, being so vulnerable in such an erotic way that it feels invasive, the audience even watching, and not lifting even a mental figure to help, right? A mental figure to help. That's where Preminger can get really interesting, but once like all of his movies, I think he's a very, very frustrating filmmaker. He's probably a master filmmaker, but the most frustrating one that ever existed, because all of his films have these extremely noticeable downsides to them. And River of No Return is no different. Yet Marilyn is great here. I believe she only agreed to do the film because she loved the songs in it. She didn't want to do a Western, which River of No Return is certainly a Western. But Marilyn's great in it. Otto doesn't give her as many close-ups as she demands. You know, an audience demands that of a Marilyn picture. We don't get to see Marilyn as often as we want to, or as close as we want to, even though she's looking so stunning and breathtaking in these kind of wide shots that Otto is so dedicated and devoted to composing his film with. I would have liked a lot more of the close-ups for her. But Otto Preminger's taste in women, I don't think, lended themselves to Marilyn Monroe's variety. Gene Seberg is a far more androgynous, or a kind of visually arresting in a separate way from Marilyn Monroe. And Otto Preminger was definitely a woman that Gene Seberg was definitely a woman that Otto Preminger was obsessed with photographing in intricately fascinating ways. Because I think she triggered something within the director, and she's visually arresting in a different way from Marilyn Monroe. She's visually arresting in the idea that she is this she's a mystery of some sort of negative connotation most of the time. Like you want to explore more about Gene Seberg, but you also understand that it might destroy you in the process, or at least destroy a moral fabric within you, at least one layer of your morality. Whereas Marilyn Monroe is just probably the most available superstar that's ever existed. Like, you watch a Marilyn Monroe film and you immediately feel like you can touch her, like you feel a texture of her. It compels the audience to feel possessive over her, and yeah, she feels like a companion of the audience, like she is right there and available, whereas Gene Seberg is always kind of a distanced object of kind of grim potential. So Otto Preminger filming Marilyn Monroe is really fascinating, but he's not too interested in her, and that kind of takes away from the power this film could have possessed. Oh, God. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. Howard Hawks, oh man, did he love every woman he ever photographed or what? Or at least really tried to. The only one he ever truly complained about was Gene Arthur. And good for Gene Arthur. Fuck you, Howard Hawks, sometimes. Howard Hawks was a genius. He was a master. And he definitely loved the sight of beautiful women. And he filmed these two women, Jane and Marilyn, perfectly well, perfectly wonderfully. He's just, his problems with Gene Seberg I haven't forgiven him for. Where he wanted to malform, in my opinion, her aesthetic, her persona, her vibe, because, well, he's confusing because he would later say of Jean Arthur's a scene in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington with her drunk, calling it the most erotic scene of 30s cinema, the one that Frank Capra directed. It's just feel like I've gotten blindingly off track here. Marilyn Monroe is an orphan that has been adopted by the cinema, and everyone who watches the film feels like they're possessive or that they do possess this outrageously, unreasonably beautiful woman. Everyone who watches a Marilyn Monroe film assumes guardianship of her in a large way. And it's by no accident. Marilyn Monroe wanted to be something that was impossible to reject and entirely difficult to ignore. You couldn't ignore her, you couldn't reject her. In fact, one look at her made you feel as if you possessed her. Marilyn Monroe, cinema's only native daughter, cinema's only true child. And everyone who ever watched her films feel as though they know her, or as if they have known her, as if they've felt her, as if they understand a part of her that others don't. And that's part of the unique power of Marilyn Monroe, that she made herself so irresistible that every member of the audience not only felt possessive over her, but felt like they had a deeper understanding or a unique experience with this woman, even though they all watched the same films. Every person will think that they had their own unique experience with her that was not only intimate, but enduring. Two films starring Marilyn Monroe: Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and River of No Return. I've been your cult boyfriend. Thanks for hanging out with me.